The final shovelful of dirt landed with a dull thud on the raw pine coffin. It was a sound of absolute finality, a door slamming shut on the life Ilara had known. The minister offered a last, hurried prayer, his words snatched away by the same biting wind that had claimed her husband Daniel, carrying him off with a fever that burned through their small cabin in less than a week. The townsfolk of Providence Gulch murmured their condolences, their eyes filled with a pity that felt sharper than scorn. They were already turning away, back to their warm homes and living families, leaving her alone with the frozen earth and the silence. Only one man remained. Thomas Graves, Daniel's older brother, stood with his hands in the pockets of a thick wool coat she knew had cost more than their entire winter stores. His face, usually set in a grim line of self-satisfaction, was arranged into a mask of solemn duty. He waited until the last black-clad figure had disappeared over the rise before he spoke, his voice as hard and cold as the ground beneath their feet. "The farm is mine now, Ilara," he stated. It was not a discussion. It was a verdict. "The deed was in my father's name, passed to me as the firstborn. Daniel was only ever working the land on my sufferance." He ignored the flash of pain and disbelief on her face. This was business. He reached into his coat and pulled out two things. The first was a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and counted out 7 silver dollars into her numb palm. "This is for your trouble, more than fair." The second was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. He pressed it into her other hand. "And this, it was our grandfather's folly, the old quarry north of the basin. It's worthless, but the deed is clear. It is yours. You have a place to go." The implication was clear. A place to go and die, far from the sight of respectable people. He did not have to say the words, "Do not come back." They hung in the air between them, colder than the wind. She looked down at the $7 and the useless deed. This was the sum of her life with Daniel. A handful of coins and a hole in the ground. The community of Providence Gulch had already rendered its judgment. She was a widow with no family, no land, no prospects. She was a burden, a ghost at the edge of their prosperous lives. They expected her to take the coins and buy a ticket on the next stagecoach heading east, to disappear into the anonymity of some crowded city and be forgotten. But as Ilara stood there, the wind whipping her thin shawl around her, something hard and unyielding began to form in her chest. It was not hope. It was something more primal, a stubborn refusal to be erased. She turned her back on the fresh grave without another look at Thomas Graves. She walked not toward the stagecoach depot, but toward Finch's Mercantile, the 7 silver dollars clutched so tightly in her fist that the edges of the coins cut into her skin. Mr. Finch watched her enter, his expression one of practiced sympathy. "A terrible business, Ilara, a terrible business. Daniel was a good man." He leaned on the counter. "The eastbound coach leaves at dawn. I can hold your fare for you." Ilara placed 3 of her dollars on the polished wood. "I need a good felling axe," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "The one with the hickory handle and a shovel head. I have a handle for it." Another dollar joined the first 3. A 50-pound sack of salt and a box of nails. Her gaze swept the shelves. "And all the twine you can sell me for this last dollar." Finch's sympathy evaporated, replaced by stunned disbelief. He stared at the coins, then at her. "Woman, what are you thinking? That quarry is a death trap, a wind-scoured pit of rock and misery. Nothing grows there. It will kill you before the first snow." He lowered his voice. "Take the town's charity. The church has a room." "This land is mine," she said, tapping the deed still in her hand. The words sounded strange, but they felt true. It was the only thing in the world that was hers. She would not let it go. She would not let them be right. She gathered her purchases, adding a small whetstone and a flint and steel with her final coins, leaving herself with nothing. With Daniel's old dog, a gray, barrel-chested animal named Boulder, trotting silently at her heels, she walked out of the store and did not look back. She turned her face to the north toward the worthless land and began the long walk into the wilderness. The journey was a punishment. The quarry was a full day's walk from town, and the path grew rougher with every mile. The weight of the axe and the salt sack dug into her shoulders, raw and unforgiving. The landscape shifted from sparse woodland to broken, rocky terrain, a land of twisted pines and gray stone that offered no comfort. Boulder stayed close, his presence a silent, solid reassurance in the growing isolation. The world she knew, the warm fires, the shared meals, the sound of human voices, receded behind her until it was just a memory. Ahead lay only what Thomas Graves had called her inheritance. She arrived as the sun was bleeding its last light across the western peaks. The sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs and replaced it with ice. It was worse than she had imagined. A deep, ugly scar carved into the side of a windswept hill, a pit of shattered rock, rubble, and stunted, thorny brush. The north wall was a sheer cliff of dark, fractured stone rising 40 feet high. The wind howled over the rim of the pit, a constant, mournful cry that seemed to mock her very presence. This was not a place to live. This was a place where things ended. Mr. Finch was right. Thomas Graves was right. The town was right. Despair, a cold and heavy blanket, settled over her. She slid to the ground, her back against the towering north face of the quarry, the tools falling from her numb fingers. The last of the sun's warmth vanished from the air, and the deep, penetrating cold of the high country began its nightly assault. Her hands were raw, her muscles screamed, and for one long, terrible moment she thought only of lying down in the rubble and letting the cold take her. It would be an easy death, and quiet end to a life of labor. Boulder nudged his wet nose into her hand, whining softly. She absently stroked his thick fur, her cheek pressed against the unyielding stone behind her. And that is when she felt it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniably there. A warmth. Not the sharp heat of a fire, but a deep, resonant warmth that seemed to pulse from the very heart of the rock. She pressed her palm flat against the dark stone. It was cool on the surface, but beneath that initial chill was a core of retained heat, a memory of the day's sun captured and held within the rock itself. Her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, traced the lines of the cliff face. It was a solid wall of dark, almost black stone, facing directly south. It had been drinking in sunlight all day, absorbing its energy like a vast stone sponge. While the air grew frigid, the rock was slowly, steadily releasing its stored warmth. Then she heard another sound, hidden beneath the ceaseless moan of the wind, a soft, rhythmic dripping. Her gaze followed the sound to a dark fissure near the base of the wall. A tiny, constant seep of clear water trickled from the rock, pooling in a small depression before vanishing into the gravelly soil. Clean water, protected from the wind. The despair did not vanish, but it receded. It made way for a grim, ferocious resolve. The rock held warmth, the fissure gave water. It was not a home, but it was a beginning. The town saw a worthless hole. Alara began to see the bones of a fortress. She picked up her shovel. The work would begin now. The first week was a blur of brutal, mind-numbing labor. Her world shrank to the quarry pit, to the bite of the axe, the scrape of the shovel, and the agonizing protest of muscles unaccustomed to such relentless punishment. Her first task was to create a space, a dugout, carved directly into the base of the towering north wall. The stone itself was too hard to quarry with her simple tools, but years of neglect had left a deep embankment of soil and fallen rubble at its foot. This she attacked with a feverish intensity. She dug until her hands were a mass of broken blisters, until her back felt as if it might snap in two. She shoveled dirt and rock, hauling it away in her own worn skirt, basketful by basketful. Boulder watched her, a silent sentinel, occasionally digging beside her with his powerful paws as if to help. Each shovelful felt like a defiant act against the judgment of Providence Gulch, against the sneering face of Thomas Graves. Slowly, painstakingly, a hollow began to form, a space 10 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with the immense heat-holding stone wall as its permanent back. This wall was the heart of her design, the secret advantage everyone else had overlooked. As she worked, she learned its rhythm. Each morning it was cool to the touch. By midday, as the sun beat down upon its dark surface, it grew warm. By late afternoon it was hot, radiating a steady, comforting heat that lasted long into the freezing nights. It was a slow, natural furnace, and she was building her life around its core. For the front and side walls of her shelter, she used the quarry's own refuse. She sorted through the rubble, her hands growing calloused and tough. She chose flat, stable stones, learning their weight and balance. She hauled them one by one, her arms straining, and began to stack them. It was agonizingly slow work. Her first attempts collapsed, a heartbreaking cascade of stone and effort. She wept with frustration, her tears freezing on her cheeks, but each failure taught her something about angles and weight and gravity. She learned to build not just with strength, but with a patient understanding of the stone itself. She found a rich deposit of clay on the quarry floor, softened by the seep from the fissure. She mixed it with water and dry grass, creating a thick, sticky mortar. With this she filled the gaps between the stones, chinking them against the wind. Each sealed crack was a victory, a small triumph against the cold that was her constant enemy. The walls rose, inch by painful inch, a testament to sheer, stubborn will. While the shelter took shape, she worked on her other systems. The water seep was a miracle she would not waste. She spent 3 days digging a small, deep pit just inside the footprint of her rising walls. She lined it meticulously with a thick layer of the wet clay, smoothing it with her hands until it was a watertight basin. Then she carved a shallow channel in the rock and earth, guiding the steady trickle from the fissure directly into her new cistern. No more hauling water. No more fighting ice. She would have clean, fresh water inside her home, a luxury few in Providence Gulch could claim. Heat was life, and she pursued it with a singular focus. The passive warmth of the stone wall was her foundation, but she knew it would not be enough in the deep freeze of winter. She needed fire. Near the eastern wall of her dugout, she found another, smaller fissure in the rock, a crack that snaked its way up the cliff face. Scrambling up the treacherous rubble, she confirmed it vented to the open air far above. It was a natural chimney. She built her hearth there, a simple U-shaped enclosure of carefully chosen stones, mortared with her clay mixture. It was small, designed for efficiency, not for show. It would consume less wood while throwing its heat against the adjacent stone, which would in turn absorb and radiate it back into the small space. The final piece of the shelter was the roof. This was the most daunting task. Using her axe, she felled several of the tough, stringy pines that grew on the ridge above the quarry. She stripped them of their branches and, with Boulder's silent help, dragged the logs down into the pit. Getting them into place as rafters was a monumental struggle of leverage and balance. More than once, a log slipped, crashing down just inches from where she stood, but finally they were set, resting on her stacked stone walls and anchored into the earth embankment at the back. Over these she laid a thick lattice of branches, and on top of that a dense layer of pine boughs. The final layer was sod, cut from the earth above the quarry and laid like heavy green shingles. It was an ugly, living roof, but it would insulate and hold against the snow. With the shelter essentially complete, a dark, cave-like space, but one that was blessedly still and silent against the wind, she turned her attention to food. Hunting or trapping would be unreliable. She needed a system. Near her dugout, in a spot that caught the southern sun, she began to dig again. Not a shelter this time, but a deep pit, 6 feet down into the earth. It was another backbreaking task, but she knew the earth itself was an insulator. She built low stone walls around the pit's edge and framed a slanting roof over it, angled toward the sun. This was the foundation for her pit greenhouse. This last part required a trip back to the world that had cast her out. She dreaded it, but it was necessary. She needed glass for her greenhouse, seeds, and a breeding pair of rabbits. She made the long walk back to Providence Gulch Boulder at her side. She was a different woman from the one who had left. Her clothes were stained and torn, her face was smudged with dirt and browned by the wind, and her hands were no longer the soft hands of a farmer's wife, but the calloused, scarred hands of a stonemason. Her appearance caused a stir. People stopped and stared. Whispers followed her down the town's single dusty street. "The Quarry Widow," they murmured. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on Finch's mercantile. Mr. Finch's jaw dropped when she walked in. He had clearly expected her to be dead. "Good Lord, woman," he stammered, "you're alive." "I need 6 panes of glass," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "And whatever vegetable seeds you have that will winter over, carrots, turnips, hardy greens, and I need to know who sells rabbits." She had no money, but she had the salt. She had bought it as a tool, a currency. "I can trade salt." Finch, recovering his composure, looked at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The trade was made. Salt was valuable, and he was a merchant above all else. As she was leaving, a wagon rattled to a stop outside. Thomas Graves climbed down. He saw her, took in her ragged appearance, the panes of glass under her arm, and the small wooden cage with 2 rabbits inside. A cruel, knowing smirk crossed his face. "Still playing at survival, are you, Ilara?" he sneered, loud enough for others to hear. "Digging in the dirt like an animal, winter will teach you the lesson you refuse to learn." She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and cold as ice. She said nothing. Her silence was more powerful than any retort. She simply turned and began the long walk back to her quarry, leaving him standing in the street, amidst the whispers of the town. The nickname they gave her that day stuck. She was no longer just the Quarry Widow. She was the Snow Witch, the mad woman who lived in a hole and courted death. Back in her stone home, she installed the glass panes on her pit greenhouse. Inside, sheltered from the wind and warmed by the earth and the angled sun, she planted her seeds in soil she had hauled from a more fertile patch of land. She built a small but solid hutch for the rabbits against the exterior of her shelter's stone wall, where they would be safe from predators and share in the radiated warmth. As autumn deepened, a routine took hold. Her days were governed by the sun and the needs of her small, self-contained world. Each morning she tended the greenhouse, watering the miraculous green shoots that pushed up from the dark soil. She fed the rabbits. She checked the cistern. Most of her time was spent with the axe. She methodically cleared the deadfall and scrub trees from the hills around the quarry, cutting and splitting the wood. She did not just gather enough for the winter, she gathered enough for 3 winters. Her wood pile grew into a massive, formidable wall, stacked neatly and protected from the elements by a lean-to roof. It was a monument to her foresight and her fear of the cold. Boulder was her shadow, her only companion. He shared the warmth of her small hearth at night, his quiet breathing a comfort in the profound silence. He alerted her to the presence of a passing deer or a curious fox. He was the keeper of her solitude, a living link to the past she had lost, and a steady presence in the future she was building with her own 2 hands. The first snows came, dusting the quarry in white. Inside her shelter, life went on unchanged. The stone wall, though it received less direct sun, still drank in whatever light it could find, and the small, efficient fire in her hearth kept the chill at bay. The air inside was warm and smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint green scent of the plants in her greenhouse. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small stone kingdom. One afternoon, a hunter named Brant, known for his loud boasts in town, tracked a deer to the edge of the quarry. He looked down and saw the strange, sod-roofed structure, a plume of smoke curling from what looked like a crack in the rock face. He returned to town with a grand story. "She's living in a cave like a bear," he declared to the men gathered around the stove in Finch's Mercantile. "The smoke comes right out of the stone. It ain't natural. They call her the Snow Witch, and they're right to. She's communing with spirits in that hole." The name stuck, cementing her status as an outcast, a figure of dark, foolish legend. The winter deepened. The world outside her quarry became a place of brutal, elemental fury. But her systems held. A rock slide loosened by a cycle of freezing and thawing crashed down one night, but her reinforced roof timbers groaned and held the weight. A pack of gaunt wolves, driven by hunger, circled the quarry for a week. Their howls echoed in the pit, a chilling sound, but her rabbits were safe in their stone hutch, and Boulder's deep, rumbling growls from the doorway kept them at a distance. These were tests, and she met them. She learned, she adapted, she reinforced. Her world was small, but it was strong. Then came the blizzard of '83. It was not a storm. It was a war declared by the sky. It began with a sky the color of a bruise and a wind that did not howl but screamed. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, scouring wall of white that erased the world. For days the sun was just a memory. The temperature plummeted to depths no one in Providence Gulch could remember. They called it the White Death. In town, it was a catastrophe. The conventional wooden houses, built to withstand ordinary winters, proved fatally fragile against this assault. The wind, like a physical hammer, found every crack, every weakness. Roofs, laden with impossible weights of snow, began to groan and collapse. Firewood, stored in outdoor sheds, was buried under 10-foot drifts, inaccessible. Chimneys, clogged with ice and snow, filled houses with blinding, choking smoke. The town's confidence, its belief in its own rugged preparedness, shattered in a matter of hours. Families huddled together in the freezing dark, listening to the sound of their homes being torn apart around them. The community was failing, but in the quarry there was a profound and uncanny calm. The wind screamed and raged far above the rim of the pit, but down in her shelter the air was still. The snow piled deep overhead, adding yet another layer of insulation to her sod roof. Inside it was a haven of warmth and order. The great stone wall, her silent, colossal partner, radiated its deep, steady warmth into the room. Even with the sun completely obscured, the sheer thermal mass of the rock resisted the brutal cold outside. Her small fire glowed in the hearth, its smoke drawn cleanly up the fissure chimney. The air was warm enough that she worked in a simple wool shirt. Her rabbits chewed contentedly in their hutch. The green plants in the pit house were untouched. She had water from her cistern, food from her root cellar, and a mountain of dry wood stacked just outside her door. She was not fighting the storm. She had built a world that existed outside its reach. On the third day of the blizzard, Boulder began to bark, a deep, insistent sound he reserved for true alarms. Ilara unbarred her heavy plank door and peered out into the swirling chaos. At first, she saw nothing but the wall of white. Then a figure materialized, stumbling, falling, crawling through the deep drift that had collected at the entrance to her quarry. It was a boy, no more than 17, his face a mask of frozen terror. He collapsed at her doorstep, gasping. She dragged him inside, away from the clawing wind, and barred the door again. She stripped off his frozen coat and wrapped him in blankets, forcing hot broth between his cracked blue lips. It was Jacob, a boy who worked as a hand for Thomas Graves. When he could finally speak, his words tumbled out in a panicked rush. "It's Mr. Graves," he gasped. "His wife. She had the baby 2 weeks ago. The roof on the west side of their house came down. The fire's out. We can't get to the woodpile. The baby, he's so cold. He's not crying anymore." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "He sent me. He said the witch in the quarry might have wood. He said to beg." Ilara felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Thomas. The man who had cast her out, who had mocked her, who had left her for dead. Now he was sending a boy to beg for the very means of survival from her. A bitter, vengeful satisfaction flickered within her, hot and sharp. Let him freeze. Let him feel the cold he had wished upon her. Let him learn his lesson. The thought was ugly, but it was there. She looked at the boy's terrified face. She thought of the woman, a wife and new mother. She thought of the silent, freezing child. Her carefully rationed resources, her mountain of firewood, were hers. She had bled for every log in that pile. To give it away felt like a betrayal of her own survival. But to hoard it, knowing a child was dying, that was a betrayal of something deeper. The moral choice was stark, stripped bare by the storm. She could be like them, ruled by pride and selfishness, or she could be someone else. She stood up. The choice was made. She would not let a child die. Not because Thomas deserved it, but because she could prevent it. She pulled on her heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf over her face. "Stay here," she told the boy. "Get warm." She opened the door and stepped out into the tempest. The wind tore at her, a physical blow. She fought her way to the massive woodpile, shielded by a small overhang. Her hands, protected by thick mittens, grew numb as she loaded a small, sturdy sled she had built from scrap wood. She piled it high with dry split pine and oak, logs that would burn hot and long. She added 2 of her thickest blankets and a sealed pail of hot soup. It was a king's ransom in this frozen hell. She dragged the sled to the entrance of the quarry, pointed the terrified boy in the direction of the Graves farm, and shouted over the wind, "Go! Do not stop!" He nodded, his face a mixture of awe and gratitude, and plunged back into the white fury, a lifeline from the woman his master had condemned. The storm raged for another full day before it finally broke. The silence that followed was as shocking as the noise had been. The world was buried, transformed into a landscape of alien shapes and impossible drifts. Later that morning, as a weak sun glinted off the new world, Boulder began to bark again. This time there were 2 figures, dark against the blinding white, struggling toward the quarry. It was Thomas Graves, carrying a bundle wrapped in blankets, and his wife, leaning on him for support. They reached her door and stopped. Thomas was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by fear and desperation. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked at Ilara, not with scorn, but with a raw, desperate humility. "The wood," he began, his voice cracking. "It saved us. But the baby, he is so weak. Our house is ruined. There is no warmth." He did not ask for permission. It was a plea beyond pride. "Please." Ilara simply stood aside and held the door open. They stumbled in. The effect on them was immediate and profound. The warmth hit them first, a gentle, radiant heat that seemed to come from all directions. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a roaring fire, but a deep, pervasive warmth that soaked into their frozen bones. Their eyes widened, trying to comprehend the space. They saw the neat stacks of supplies, the small, tidy hearth with its barely there fire, the green plants growing under the glass, the calm animals. They saw the solid stone walls and the cistern of clear water. They stared at the great dark back wall of the shelter, the source of the impossible heat. It was clean, quiet, and impossibly alive. This was not the hovel of a madwoman. It was a sanctuary. Thomas's wife, Mary, sank onto a bench, clutching her baby. Ilara took the child from her gently. She unwrapped the blankets. The infant was pale and still, his breathing shallow. Without a word, she took the baby to the warmest part of the room, right beside the great stone wall, and wrapped him in fresh, dry wool. Thomas watched her, his gaze sweeping the room again and again, his mind struggling to reconcile the reality of this place with the legend the town had created. He touched the back wall. It was warm, like a living thing. He looked at the firewood that had saved his family, and then at the colossal woodpile visible through the open door. He saw the years of labor, the foresight, the sheer intelligence of it all, the mockery, the sneers, the name they had all used, Snow Witch. It all curdled into a deep, burning shame. He turned to Alara, his eyes wet. The admission came out as a choked whisper. "We were wrong," he said. He looked at her calloused hands, at the strength in her face. "We called you a fool. My God, we were the fools." He sank his head into his hands. "I left you to die, and you built a paradise." Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not speak of the injustice, of the cruelty. Vengeance was a luxury she had no time for. She looked at the humbled man who had wronged her, and then at the child fighting for its life, and she felt only a quiet sense of purpose. Her response was simple, practical kindness. "There is stew," she said softly, ladling a bowl from the pot warming by the hearth. "Eat. Your wife needs her strength." Her grace was more absolute, more crushing than any condemnation could ever have been. Over the next few days, her quarry became a refuge. As word spread of the Graves family's survival, others made the desperate journey. She took them all in. The hunter, Brant, arrived half-frozen, his bravado gone, and wept with gratitude for a bowl of her rabbit stew. Mr. Finch, from the Mercantile, his store's roof collapsed, sat silently by her hearth, staring at the warm stone wall as if it were a religious artifact. Her small shelter was crowded, but it was warm, and it was safe. She shared her food, her warmth, her water. She shared the life she had built from their scorn. When the great thaw finally came and the people of Providence Gulch could take stock of the devastation, they looked at the world with new eyes. Their town was shattered, but the Snow Witch's quarry had held. The nickname was still used, but now it was spoken with a deep and abiding reverence. She was not a witch who communed with dark spirits. She was a woman who understood deeper things, stone and sun and wind, and the relentless truth of winter. The aftermath of the White Death changed Providence Gulch forever. People came to the quarry not for refuge, but for knowledge. They came to learn. Ilara, quiet and patient, showed them. She explained the principle of the thermal mass, of facing a structure to the sun. She showed them how to build with stone, not just wood, how to dig pit greenhouses to grow food through the winter, how to build small, efficient hearths that conserved fuel. She gave her knowledge as freely as she had given her firewood. The town rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. New homes were constructed with thick stone walls. Root cellars were dug deeper. Wood piles were not just large, they were immense, and they were protected. The lessons of the quarry were written into the new architecture of the town. Her story spread, carried by travelers to other settlements in the high country, a legend of resilience and ingenuity. One day in the spring, Thomas Graves came to her quarry one last time. He held out a piece of paper. It was the deed to her old farm, the one he had taken from her. "It's yours," he said. "It was always rightfully yours. I was blinded by greed." Alara looked at the deed, then around at the quarry, at the solid walls she had raised with her own hands, at the green shoots in her garden. She shook her head. "My home is here," she said. "I built it." She had no desire to return to the life that had been stolen from her. She had created a new one, stronger and more true. Years passed. Ilara remained in her quarry home, a quiet pillar of the community she had once been cast out of. Her shelter became a landmark, a symbol of survival and wisdom. She never married again, but she was never alone. She was the heart of the town, the keeper of its deepest lesson, that the things we discard as worthless, a rocky pit, a stubborn woman, often hold the very key to our salvation. In her old age she would often sit outside her door on a summer evening, her back pressed against the great stone wall, feeling the day's sun radiating gently into her. She would watch the sunset paint the sky with color, boulders descendant lying at her feet, at peace in the world she had carved from stone and silence. She had been given a death trap and had turned it into a sanctuary. She had been given a curse and had transformed it into a legacy. Her strength was not in what she had endured, but in the quiet, unyielding grace with which she had prevailed.